Hello and welcome to this video, and today I'd like to talk a little bit about 80s jazz fusion. So I grew up, I suppose, I formed my music listening interests in the 1980s. So I started the decade listening to sort of the new wave of British heavy metal, which took me to classic rock, which eventually took me to prog. And then from prog I then discovered jazz fusion, the Mahavishnu Orchestra, Weather Report, Chick Corea, the usual story. And on this channel I've really been discussing a lot of those classic fusion albums from the 70s, which I absolutely love, and I think so many of you watching it love those albums too. But growing up in the 80s, as I was going down the library and pulling out encyclopedias of rock and jazz to try and work out who these artists were, because obviously before the internet it was impossible to find out easily who were the main people in jazz fusion. I discover certain artists, and of course in the 1980s these artists were still working. So I'd go down the local record shop, and they often didn't have the 70s fusion albums, but what they had was the latest releases from the 1980s. So I would start to buy the albums by Miles Davis, or the albums by Chick Corea, or the albums by John McLaughlin that were coming out at that time. Now, very soon I started to become a little bit wary of the 1980s fusion albums. They seemed to be a little bit safer, a little bit more, pandering to commerciality than the 70s fusion albums. And the 70s fusion albums, of course, was a fusion between, rock music, funk and jazz, but they were fusing with music that was at the time very exciting. I think the early fusion guys were listening to people like Jimi Hendrix and Cream, and they were listening to Yes and Genesis and, all sorts of different music, and James Brown, and Parliament Funkadelic. And those are really, all of those bands are quite way out bands in themselves. So the fusion was able to build on top of that. And I think also after the 60s there was a market commercially. The hippies were looking to go further out. So albums like Bitches Brew and Jack Johnson and the Mahavishnu Orchestra could sell to people who wanted to sort of have their minds blown. But as jazz fusion develops through the 70s, they start selling records, and the record companies start to notice this, and people start to have hits. Weather Report has a big hit with Birdland, Herbie Hancock has a big hit with Chameleon. And so they see a commercial potential, and the commercial potential is a sort of lighter type of fusion, a more funkier type of fusion, which towards the end of the 70s becomes the style. I often call this Fusac, or middle of the road jazz fusion, And some of those albums I still really like. I can appreciate the beauty of the musicianship on it. There's some really strong compositions. So I'm not down on Grover Washington or David Sanborn or all those people. I do like those albums. But I think once that style was in place, that much more commercial, middle of the road, jazz FM friendly style, once that was in place, then they started to carry on fusing with, rather than the avant-garde and progressive rock music, the sort of pop music was coming out. So in the 1980s, you then have the emergence of people like Michael Jackson and Madonna, and you get that sort of very sequence music, gated reverb, drum machines, early sampling, all those pop music styles start to creep into the 80s jazz fusion. Now, me personally, I don't think that those styles mixed with jazz have worn well. And so what I found was, people that I loved in the 70s, like Stanley Clarke and Herbie Hancock and Chick Corea, all had their ears to this new sound, and good on them, because they should have been keeping up, but I didn't really like that style of music. I just found that pandering to commerciality was sort of, rather than aiding improvisation, was actually hemming it in, which of course machines, improvising with machines, sequences and samplers is a difficult thing. It can be done, but it has to be done in a certain way. I think, and I've spoken about this on my Miles Davis in the 80s videos, that Miles did it really well, and Miles was one of the really important artists through the 80s that really, seemed to still be able to take on all those influences, but allow for some really serious improvisation to go on. But on the whole, there does seem to be an explosion of very commercial, middle-of-the-road jazz fusion at that time. That would be personified for me by a record label like GRP that started to pump out really radio-friendly jazz. Chick Corea was on GRP. He brought out the Electric Band on GRP. Now, the Electric Band in the 80s, for me, is one of the seminal 80s jazz fusions, and I do like those albums. But also on GRP, you start to see, you know, like Dave Grusin was releasing stuff on there, and then you had all the Chick Corea spin-offs. So John Patitucci was bringing out solo albums, and Eric Marienthal was bringing out albums. You know, new artists were emerging, and for me, I was always disappointed by those albums. So many times, you know, I would discover a fantastic musician like, say, Frank Gambale, that I still think is one of the greatest guitarists who's ever lived, incredible guitarist, rush out, you know, buy an expensive album on import, early Frank Gambale album, and when I got it home I was a little bit let down by it, because it was just a bit safe, you know, that. So as time's gone on, I started to dig deeper, and I started to see that there were certain artists that were still holding a torch for jazz fusion. Now, in terms of the 70s style jazz fusion, I think the bands that you really need to check out would be people like Tribal Tech and Scott Henderson. I think they still made, you know, exploratory and aggressive jazz fusion in the 80s, and still managed to sound like the 80s. Pat Metheny emerges as an absolute giant at that time. In his albums, he forged his own way, and Pat Metheny did some incredible stuff. So that would be another artist I would be saying that is essential listening from the 80s. John Scofield also, you know, with his Blue Matter band and albums like Still Warm, Loud Jazz, he seemed to be able to, you know, work in that 80s fusion style, but do some really heavy and aggressive fusion that still had the spirit of the 70s fusion. But what I'd like to discuss on this video is stuff that was going on as well at the same time, you know, underground. Now, I've just done a video on Bill Laswell, and I've said that Bill Laswell was one of the most important musicians in terms of fusion in the 1980s, and I think that's the case. Laswell emerges in, you know, the late 70s, early 80s, and he's fusing jazz and rock, but he's doing it in a completely new way. And I think this is one of the key things to understand 80s jazz, is that perhaps a lot of the 70s guard didn't quite know how to carry on making groundbreaking music while fusing. They didn't quite know how to do it anymore. Maybe they got a little bit older. The commercial constraints of their history and their position at that time meant that they couldn't take the risks that they were allowed to take in the early 70s. But most importantly, I think they were still trying to fuse it in the methods and techniques that they developed in the 70s, you know, and really there are other ways of fusing jazz and rock or pop music. There are other ways, and I think Bill Laswell was an artist that showed you another way of doing it. Now, how did he do that? Well, first off, a lot of the musicians he was using, rather than coming out of sort of the post-Coltrane modal way of playing, he was using musicians that had come out of the Ornette Coleman style of jazz, which is very different to Coltrane's. And this is quite interesting when you look at musicians like John Scofield and Pat Metheny, because they as well are Ornette Coleman style players. So to understand this element that starts to creep into fusion that wasn't there in the 70s, you have to understand Ornette Coleman and what Ornette Coleman did. Now, what Ornette Coleman did was, whereas someone like John Coltrane was trying to take the structure of jazz, the chord progression way of improvising, so you are improvising upon the chord progression, you're drawing your notes and phrases from the shape and harmonic content of the chord progression, rather than do that, Ornette Coleman placed an emphasis on all the aspects in music, and he had a thing called his harmonic process, which was really harmonics meant like harmony, motion, and melody. You know, it was basically the idea that you don't necessarily have to follow the chord change. You can follow other things. You can follow the internal logic of the solo. You could look at what you're playing, the melody, and go, well, this melody wants to go this way. I know the chords are going that way, but I'm going to carry on. I'm going to go that way. But also rhythmically, I think with Ornette Coleman, he places an emphasis on rhythm, which is different. You know, that there's a logic to rhythm that allows you to go in a certain direction that might not be following harmonically, but is also following a rhythmical logic. But also Ornette was interested in, you know, free jazz sounds. He was interested in, you know, notes, microtonal notes in between notes. He was interested in noise. He was interested in all sorts of things. If you check out Ornette's album Free Jazz, that's really pushing right to the, you know, extremes of what we would class as improvisation. You know, how do you not, you know, play melodically? How do you not play rhythmically? These are all the questions that the free jazz musicians were asking, and Ornette Coleman was the leader of that. Now, what's really interesting, in the late 70s, Ornette formed a fusion band, and they were called Prime Time. And that really takes its lead from sort of Ornette's harmonic approach mixed with almost like James Brown funk. And I just want to pull an album out. It's the only album I'm going to show you to represent 80s jazz. It's this one, which is from, I'm just going to check the date out. I'm pretty sure it's 80s. It's either 80s or late 70s, 1982. This album is a real essential album, I think, if you want to understand the new jazz parts of the interesting bits in 80s jazz fusion. Ornette Coleman, Of Human Feelings. Very funky album, but a very out there album. A lot of the primetime stuff is really worth checking out. So musicians that had come up in that sphere, they start to move into different areas, you know. So you have people like James Chance, who are really taking that James Brown funk and almost like a punk element, because of course punk's happened, new wave has happened, hip hop has happened, and I don't think a lot of those mainstream jazz fusion musicians had their ear to that, but someone like Bill Laswell did. So Laswell takes that sort of punky, funky, new wave ethos, and he starts to bring in musicians that are Ornette Coleman style musicians. This is what it sounds like to my ear. And you get something really interesting happening at that point. But that influence is also seen in other musicians as well. And I'm going to be doing videos on all of these now, because I think to mainstream jazz fusion audience, these artists aren't known. I don't think Laswell's stuff's known that well. But another musician that was really influenced by that approach would be John Zorn. And I'm going to be doing a big video on John Zorn. But John Zorn really, you know, he fuses a sort of punk free jazz attitude with a sort of very modern, short attention span, you know, way of listening to music, where you're really almost like, as he said, it's almost like flipping channels on cable TV. And so he would jump genres very quickly. You know, he would use extreme noise. He would use genre in a very, very interesting way. And I'm going to be doing a video on John Zorn. But John Zorn will be an artist that is also creating a different type of fusion. And another artist that was creating a different type of fusion was Steve Coleman and the whole M-Bass crew. And they again took ideas from Ornette Coleman for the harmonic approach, took ideas from James Brown, and also ideas from hip hop as well, and mixed all that up in I would say one of the most important new forms to emerge in jazz fusion in the last 30 or 40 years. Now, I don't want to get really into detail in the artists. I just want to use this as an introduction for those of you who are now watching my videos, and you'll start to see videos on Bill Laswell, you'll see videos on John Zorn, you'll see videos on Steve Coleman and Greg Osby and Gary Thomas and all these musicians that are coming out of this alternative jazz fusion world. But something that must be really discussed here in this video was the influence of Wynton Marsalis. All right. Anybody who's watched the Ken Burns jazz documentaries will have noticed that, although that is a brilliant, overview of jazz, especially when Ken Burns is dealing with early jazz through to bebop, through to swing. But once you get to the 1960s, he seems to start to miss out really important artists. So there is no mention of John McLaughlin in those Ken Burns jazz documentaries. There is no mention of Electric Miles Davis. There's no mention of Keith Jarrett or Pat Metheny or John Schofield or Steve Coleman or Bill Laswell. They're just not mentioned in the Ken Burns view of jazz, which has become the mainstream view of jazz. Jazz, when the fusion thing came along, it went in the wrong direction. It got commercialized. The jazz fusion stuff was not as important, was not as groundbreaking, experimental, as artistic as straight jazz. I've dealt with this in a video called Why Music Critics Hate Jazz. But this is something I was really noticing as I was buying this stuff in the 1980s. Now, I can remember in around about 1982, they had a documentary on the TV about Wynton Marsalis. And Wynton Marsalis was this new virtuoso jazz trumpeter that had made a name for himself, because not only was he making fantastic jazz, but he was also working in the classical world. And this always seems to impress, a mainstream audience. Oh my God, a jazz musician can actually play classical music. Nobody ever considers this the other way, that virtually no classical musicians can play jazz, right? But the fact that he could do this, I think, warranted a documentary on television. And in that, Wynton Marsalis really laid out his worldview of jazz. And he said he didn't dislike the jazz fusion, but he found it was very easy, that anyone could play over it. And he was really arguing for a return to a more classic jazz. So when you watch the Wynton Marsalis group in the 1980s, they could well be stood up in 1962 as opposed to 1982. It's guys back in the suits with a microphone playing post-hard bop jazz. As time's gone on, Wynton Marsalis has gone even further back, going into Louis Armstrong and John Coltrane and Duke Ellington, and really arguing for a type of jazz where the worth is really to do with the history. And this really links into the incredible legacy of Afro-American artists in jazz, So really seeing this as an Afro-American art form, which I agree, of course this is an Afro-American art form. But for me, the whole thing about jazz is a nuclear reactor for music. You put elements in there and new things come out. So when Wynton Marsalis started to hark back and say, this is the proper way of playing jazz, it's, for me, it was like going backwards. And it ostracized a whole bunch of musicians, and many of them black musicians, that were then put outside the idea of that genre, of the jazz genre. Now maybe the jazz genre had become a millstone around the neck for some of these musicians. I would hate to describe Bill Laswell as a jazz musician, and I'm sure there's many purists of the fact that he's never done a recording of Stella by Starlight and he's never played through chord changes, would argue that he's not actually a proper jazz musician. That attitude that you get in jazz really emerges in the early 80s with that movement that comes in with Wynton Marsalis. Now, Wynton Marsalis himself had a brother, Branford Marsalis. And Branford Marsalis, for me, was the more interesting musician, because Branford had a forward-looking attitude like a proper jazz musician should. And he did stuff like that, which are well worth checking out. Albums like Buckshot La Funk, I hope I've said that right, where he really brings in hip-hop and funk and mixes it all together. And one of the big things that happened in the 80s that must be mentioned in terms of jazz fusion was Branford then was grabbed by Sting. Sting, of course, was one of the biggest pop stars of the 1980s, and probably the biggest rock band of the 1980s from the Police. And when he left the Police, he formed this new band, which had in it Omar Hakim from Weather Report, Darryl Jones from Miles Davis's band, Branford Masalas on saxophone, and Kenny Kirkland, who was also from Wynton Marsalis' group. And there they are, not just playing fusion, but playing fusion in stadiums to a pop audience. That for me was really, really important, because suddenly there was a little spotlight on these musicians in the mainstream. You know, I was suddenly able to put on television or put the radio on and hear a solo by Branford Marsalis, and he was going for it. I can remember being at school, and they did a thing from Remembrance Day, and they played a Sting song, and I can remember standing in assembly with all, you know, there, listening to Branford Marsalis really going for it in assembly in my school, thinking, this is weird, this is what's he doing here, you know, these are my guys, this is jazz fusion. And so I think one of the things that Sting did was really focus on the incredible, you know, musicians that are coming out of fusion, and you see then fusion musicians becoming the go-to musicians for pop artists. You know, Omar Hakim then went on to join Madonna's band. You know, Darryl Jones then went on to join the Rolling Stones. So these are all the stories that are actually going on. But I think in terms of jazz, that overwhelming idea that comes out in the 1980s, that to be a proper jazz musician, you have to play proper jazz, be able to play through standards, be able to play through chord changes. It denies all the innovations that were made by John Coltrane, that were made by Miles Davis, that were made by Ornette Coleman, and that were made by the fusion guys. These advances and approaches that freed musicians. And what this does, it allows musicians to be invited in. New musicians can come in, right? Now, one of the interesting things for me, like many rock musicians that emerged in the 80s, we came from heavy rock and heavy metal. You know, we were listening to Joe Satriani and Steve Vai. So many jazz musicians found their route in. And the reason why they could get that route in, because there was a route that went from like blues to rock to jazz fusion, and then jazz fusion through to jazz. And I think that's really, really important to keep this form alive. Now, since the internet has emerged now, there's been a big explosion of fusion on the internet with people like Snarky Puppy, people like Noah and Louis Cole. There's and when you put an album like Kendrick Lamar's To Pimp a Butterfly album, I would say that is one of the great modern jazz fusion albums. And we now have Thundercat. He's doing adverts for, what is it, Pepsi or Coca-Cola? I won't advertise on it, but one of those, you know. And Jacob Collier is doing stuff as well. And that is down not to that Wynton Marsalis approach. If we'd have gone with that wholly, none of this would have happened. But these new musicians have come out because a lot of the pioneering that was done in the 1980s, not by those GRP artists in the mainstream, but actually by a whole bunch of musicians that haven't necessarily got the credit. And I really need to mention here Steve Coleman. Steve Coleman is like the John Coltrane of the last 35 years. You know, he really has created a style of playing which has been so influential that every new jazz fusion artist that I spot on YouTube often has Steve Coleman's approach in their DNA, you know. And so if you want to know more about Steve Coleman, I'm going to be doing a video about him, so you can be able to check that out. But yeah, so 80s jazz fusion, to conclude, you know, approach it with caution. You know, you an artist that you love from the 60s and 70s is highly likely in the 80s to be chucking a bunch of like programmed drums and gated reverb and dodgy samples and vocal hooks trying to get a hit. And you'll be thinking, well, where's the jazz? There's so much of that. There's so much bland, easy listening. You know, it's like that cliche that jazz fusion is elevator music. You know, that's been thrown at me loads of time. You know, or it sounds like the soundtrack to an adult movie. You know, all these things that get thrown at jazz fusion. The accusations, and I'm thinking, God, if I stepped into a lift and they were playing, you know, Icing the Body Electric or, you know, the Inner Mountain Flame, it would be absolutely ridiculous, you know. But that reputation became from a lot of the sort of real middle of the road jazz that emerged in the 1980s. But under this was other artists. And I think the reason why they don't get classed as jazz fusion, because although they fused jazz with rock, pop, funk, hip hop, or whatever they were fusing it with, it didn't sound like the fusion from the 70s. And that's the way you have to approach it. And there's one more thing I want to say in this video. As a musician, I've become aware that a lot of musicians that I know that I would class as very, very good musicians, they're highly skilled and very able, right? They really have created an almost dogmatic approach to music. They judge music based upon the skills that would be required to make that bland jazz fusion from the 1980s. That sort of, I was going to call it, say, Yo Cats approach. Now, Yo Cats is a track by Frank Zappa, which you should go and check out after this video. He really takes the mickey out of that sort of LA studio scene, you know, that sort of people like Richard T and Steve Gadd came out. And I love those, I love them, but there's a sort of session musician scene that emerged in the late 70s, which is no longer there. It's not there anymore. That session scene is gone. But there's still, 40 years later, there's still musicians that are judging the quality of what they do on the skills and standards that would have been required to survive in 1982, doing pop sessions and playing on jazz fusion albums, you know, lame, middle of the road jazz fusion albums, you know, personified by probably the king of lame jazz fusion, Kenny G, you know, that type of thing. And there's still musicians out there that I can see are judging what they do stylistically, creatively, skill level by that, and actually turning around and asking themselves, why aren't I getting gigs? Why aren't people, you know, valuing this thing? And it's really come out of two things, I think. It's that idea of the session world that emerged in that lame jazz fusion area, and this idea that's come from Wynton Marsalis that of proper jazz and the ability to play through jazz hands and learning your craft, you know. No, if you listen to the music, take what you want from it, and then put it into your own music, right? If you are doing exciting, creative, improvised music with incredible rhythms and incredible grooves, but you can't play through giant steps, it does not matter, right? You probably can't play through Louis Armstrong Hot 5 tunes either, because that's another way of playing jazz. You probably wouldn't be able to function in the Count Basie band or Duke Ellington's orchestra, because that's another way of playing jazz. All these musicians pioneered ways of playing music that were incredible, and it moves the movement forward. That did happen in the 1980s, but it got squeezed, and it got squeezed underground. I'm going to be exploring some of these artists from now on, but I hope this video has just alerted some of you to the fact that there is some really interesting stuff there, but also maybe you might question, you know, some of these albums, you know, that have that emerged at that time. But anyway, I hope that's been of some interest to you. This is my introduction to 80s jazz fusion, and if you keep your eye out, you'll be seeing a video on John Zorn coming up, and a video on Steve Coleman and M-Bass coming up. And if you want to watch some other videos about 80s jazz fusion, because I have done a couple, check out my Bill Laswell one, and check out the Miles Davis in the 80s video. Okay, so I hope that's been of interest to you, and I will see you soon. Like, subscribe, and put some comments in and tell me whether I'm right or wrong, because I have had a bit of a rant, and I think you like me having a bit of a rant, so I'm trying to rant a little bit more now. So if you agree with what I say, agree, and if you don't, you know, let's have a nice friendly discussion. So thank you very much, see you soon, bye.